Hi everyone, I am Gillard Bitilinamisa, an AB Political Science student of Western Institute of Technology. Today I'm going to discuss to you guys the public administration as governance. The many failed development interventions in the 50s into the 90s spurred the introduction of other development reforms. The governance paradigm was introduced and advocated by the United Nations, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and other international institutions. The word governance suddenly has become something of a mantra in recent years, authored by donors, reforms, and pundits alike. Governance entails a large scope and has a wider meaning, though the term governance has been used to refer mostly to government when correctly used. Governance really goes beyond government. It involves the institutionalization of a system through which citizens, institutions, organizations, and groups in a society articulate their interests, exercise their rights, and mediate their differences in pursuit of the collective good. United Nations Development Program describes it as the exercise of political, economic, and administrative authority to manage a nation's affair. It embraces all of the methods, good and bad, that society used to distribute power and manage public resources and problems. Scholars and development institutions argue that good governance is not only an essential component but also a precondition for development. That is, development cannot exist without good governance. Thus, good governance is necessary in the planning and implementation of local, regional, and national development programs that focus on poverty reduction initiatives for the impoverished sectors in the rural areas, the landless, indigenous peoples, and the marginal farmers and fishermen. Kofi Annan, 1997, in his inaugural speech in the First International Conference on Governance for Sustainable Growth and Equity in United Nations, New York, in July 28 to 30, 1997, affirms this when he said that good governance and sustainable development are indivisible. That is the lesson of all our efforts and experiences from Africa to Asia to Latin America. Without good governance, without the rule of law, predictable administration, legitimate power, and responsive regulation, no amount of funding, no amount of charity will set us on the path to prosperity. We are fully engaged in efforts to improve governance around the world. Good governance is indispensable for building peaceful, prosperous, and democratic societies. Annan concluded that good governance is perhaps the single most important factor in eradicating poverty and promoting development. Good governance has become a common public utterance among development actors and institutions all over the world. It is a common belief among major development institutions today that promoting good governance is an important part of their agenda. Good governance initiatives of the World Bank and other multilateral development banks address the needs of economic institutions and public sectors management, including transparency and accountability, regulatory reform, and public sector skills and leaderships. Democratic governance and human rights aspects of political governance. Other organizations like the United Nations, European Commissions, and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development are more likely to highlight democratic governance and human rights. To highlight democratic governance and Democratic governance and human rights. Aspect of political governance. Other organizations like the United Nations, European Commission, and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development are more likely to highlight democratic governance and human rights, aspects of political governance avoided by the bank. Some of the many issues that are treated under the governance programs of various donors, including election monitoring, political party support, combating corruption, building independent judiciaries, security sector reform, improved service delivery, transparency of government accounts, decentralization, civil and political rights, government responsiveness and forward vision, the stability of the regulatory environment for private sector activities, including price systems, exchange regimes, and banking systems. Carino 2002, in her reflections on the term governance, identified actors and factors that push for governance. She acknowledged that governance is not the sole responsibility of the government per se, but the role of the market and civil society are of equal importance too and should also be recognized. She then identified the factors or processes that push for governance, and some of these are the quest for growth and development, the environmental movement, globalization, and consolidating peace. These are practically the same values or virtues found in the UN Charter. Likewise, governance promotes the virtues of decentralization, participation, responsiveness, and accountability, among others. Good governance from governance. The concept of good governance has emerged and became prominent in international aid circles around 1989 or 1990. It served as a general guiding principle for donor agencies to demand that recipient governments adhere to proper administrative processes in the handling of development assistance and put in place effective policies instruments towards the end in handling of development assistance and put in place effective policies instrument towards that end. When there is good governance, there is sustainable development. An ADB document 2005 affirms that good governance is synonymous with sound development management. They then identified some key principles of development which may be considered as elements of good governance. These are accountability, participation, predictability, and transparency. Key dimensions and specific areas of action. Accountability means making establishing criteria to measure public sector management, public official answerable for performance of public officials, public enterprise management, government behavior, and institutionalizing mechanism to public financial management responsive to the entity from ensure that standards are met, which they derive authority. Civil service reform. Good governance matters for development and the capacity to address difficult issues of poverty reduction has become a mantra for development professionals. While many are pleased to see development debates move beyond an earlier approach that promised development when poor countries get the policies right, the adoption of good governance paradigm implies a wide range of institutional preconditions for economic and political development and poverty to be significantly reduced. Key dimension and specific area of action. Basic element of good governance. Key dimensions, specific area of action. Accountability. means making public officials answerable for government behavior and responsive to the entity from which they derive authority. Establishing criteria to measure performance of public officials, institutionalizing mechanisms ensure that standards are met. Specific area of action: public sector management, public enterprise management, public financial management, civil service reform. Participation refers to enhancing people's access to and influence on public policy processes. Key dimensions: undertaking development for and by the people. Specific area of action: participation of beneficiaries and affected groups. Interface between government and private sector. Decentralization of public and service delivery functions. Empowerment of local government. Cooperation with non-government organizations. Predictability refers to the existence of laws, regulations, and policies to regulate society and consistent application for these laws and development. Key dimensions: establishing and sustaining appropriate legal and institutional arrangements, observing and upholding the rule of law, maintaining consistency of public policies. Specific area of action: legal framework for private sector development. Transparency refers to the availability of the information to the general public and clear government rules, regulations, and decisions. Key dimensions: ensuring access to accurate, timely information about the economy and government policies. Specific area of action: disclosure of information. It is participatory, consensus-oriented, accountable, transparent, responsive, effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive, and follows the rule of law. Participation by both men and women is a key cornerstone of good governance. It is important to point out that representative democracy does not necessarily mean the concern of the most vulnerable in society would be taken into consideration in decision making. Participation needs to be informed and organized. This means freedom of association and expression on the one hand, and an organized civil society on the other hand. Good governance requires fair legal frameworks that are enforced impartially. It also requires full protection of human rights, particularly those of minorities. Impartial enforcement of laws requires an independent judiciary and an impartial and incorruptible police power. Transparency means that decisions taken and their enforcement are done in a manner that follows rules and regulations. It also means that information is freely available and directly accessible to those who will be affected by such decisions and their enforcement. It also means that enough information is provided and that it is provided easily understandable reforms and media. Good governance requires that institutions and processes try to serve all stakeholders within a reasonable time frame. A society well-being depends on ensuring that all its members feel that they are a stake in it and do not feel excluded from the mainstream of society. This requires all groups, but particularly the most vulnerable, have opportunities to improve or maintain their well-being. Good governance means the processes and institutions produce results that meet the needs of society while making the best use of resources at their disposal. The concept of efficiency in the context of good governance also covers the sustainable use of natural resources and the protection of the environment. Accountability is a key requirement of good governance. Not only governmental institutions, but also the private sector and civil society organizations must be accountable to the public and to their institutional stakeholders. Who is accountable to who varies depending on whether decisions or action taken are internal or external to an organization or institution. In general, an organization or an institution is accountable to those who will be affected by its decisions or actions. Accountability cannot be enforced without transparency and the rule of law. Governance and good governance. There are many ways to define governance and good governance. However, there seems to be a general consensus that key factors included technical and managerial competence, organizational capacity, reliability, predictability, and the rule of law. Accountability, transparency, and open information systems, and participation. Technical and managerial competence of civil governance is an obvious factor of good governance. This may be less of a constraint than it used to be, as access to education has improved, but rapid changes require ongoing development on skills. Shifts. Shifts in global governance. Public administration to public management. Centralized, uniform, top-down service delivery to decentralized, diverse, localized service delivery. Self-sufficiency to interlinked sectors. Hierarchical control to empowerment. Upward accountability to outward accountability. Standardized procedures to performance orientation. A political civil service to advocacy-oriented civil service. Individual skill building to organizational competence. Shifts, not new, but matters a great deal. Probably the new thing about governance is that everyone, government, civil societies, private sector, international organizations are now talking about it and doing things to improve it. It is a task of leadership designed to ensure proper growth and accountability that provide a balance between responsibilities for tangibles and intangibles. Tangibles for tasks and intangibles for relationships. This discussion is based on the link above. Thank you. That's the end of